Topic 4 was on the opportunities and challenges of bilateral and multilateral relations between Africa and other countries. A case of Africa-China relations.
And multilateral relations between countries can potentially enhance the quality of investments that countries can derive, and most importantly, can ease the movement of persons and goods with a much needed reduction in capital and human costs.
It was presented by Dr. Liu Haifang, an associate professor at Peking University in China.
And for the first stage, people have said so much about FOCAC. For me, this is also one of the most important turning point for the bilateral cooperation. And then also the latest development you have seen, as yesterday you also heard from our ambassador, how the FOCAC has started to be synchronized with the BRR. What does it mean? These two particular platforms, how they cooperate with each other, also one of the key things I think we need to elaborate. And then I come with the conclusion part with some thought about the role of think tank, which is the key theme for today. And
The panel of discussants included Mr. Dean Mulozi, Mr. Chola Chabala, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of National Development Planning, Mr. Detrick Remat, a research associate at Institute of Public Policy Research in Namibia, and Mr. Chanda from Sino-Hydro in Zambia.
If information could be nicely disseminated.
Mr. Chola Chabala said through the China-Africa relationship, there is need for Zambia and Africa as a whole to leverage on China's way of development through considering issues such as population and parastatals which China has used to develop.
Look at two important issues. We learned that population growth is inimical to development. The Chinese have defeated that. So it's what you do with the population that matters. We also have learned that unless you privatize, unless you become 100% private only, because the private sector has got efficiency and all sorts of things. But the Chinese have used parastatal companies to advance their development and converted it to what is called state capitalism. So the whole story is we need to think different from the books that were prescribed to us by other people who do not even understand the socio-economic context of Africa.
Thank you for the opportunity and good morning to everybody.
Mr. Detrick Remat said there is need for think tanks to advocate for better security and customs when negotiating for goods exported to China for Africa as a whole.
We need to look at, so tourism in Namibia is really, really important, as well as for Botswana, and the issues around not just illegal timber harvesting, but also poaching of especially rhinos and elephants. And I guess I don't really need to emphasize this kind of issue. I think most of you will be aware in the room how sensitive and how worrisome this is for private sector, for the tourism sector, but also for government at large. But I don't see that national governments really actively challenge this issue. The professor just mentioned the security aspect is becoming, security aspect cooperation is becoming more and more important between China and Africa. So I would suggest, we need rather less military cooperation. We need more police cooperation with China. We need to ensure that our customs at the borders are strengthened, especially if the kind of exports that go into Asian markets, so we can address these issues. And I also understand from what I've read, I might be wrong, but that I don't know why perhaps Zambia, the DRC, perhaps Botswana and Namibia cannot establish together with China a kind of raw material timber raw material certification process to ensure that this raw material is harvested sustainably. Because I'm also sure that a lot of Chinese private customers in China would be interested in knowing that the products that they buy at home in China are harvested sustainably in Africa. Thank you.
From the point of view of civil society and the citizens of Africa, we have I spent some time, I was part of the strategic planning team of ECOSOC during the 2015-2016. We spent time in 5 regions of Africa. And the worry within African citizens that the relationships that we have, either bilateral or multilateral with other nations, we feel that we are at a weaker part, negotiations, and we seem not to be in the right path. That is the citizen inputs, and we struggle to find out what are the real challenges and what are what inputs. How do we make Africa to be relevant in these partnerships?
The challenges that we have is that of lack of information. If information could be nicely disseminated, once investors are coming to the country, information is given to them as concerns the labor laws, on our statutes. It would be very easy for them to actually follow those rules and work with the locals. So,
the discussants agreed that China can play a key role in helping Africa attain Agenda 2063. However, challenges exist in the conditionalities that come with China's help that does not favor citizens in Africa, such as poor working conditions. Nonetheless, there is need for African Union and China to continue cooperating on growth prospects for Africa. Topic 5 was on the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative on African manufacturing and industrialization. Opportunities for CFTA.
You'll note that among policymakers and scholars alike, a robust manufacturing and trade infrastructure is broadly understood as a fundamental path to economic growth and development.
It was presented on the second day by Dr. Pamela Nankamba Kabaso, the Executive Director for Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research, and discussed by a panel of discussants that included Mr. Inombe Lutangu, Lecturer of Economics at the University of Zambia, Mr. Benedict Musengele, Senior Research Fellow at COMESA, Mrs. Kedibonye Sekakela, Research Fellow at Botswana Institute for Development Policy and Analysis, Mr. Wang from Sinoma, Dr. Muchemwa Sinkala, Director, Zambia Development Agency, and Dr. Gabriel Pollen, Lecturer for Economics at the University of Zambia. The presentation highlighted that African countries can leverage the Belt and Road Initiative for foreign direct investment and investments in research and development and manufacturing. The challenge that exists is that the foreign direct investments from China is concentrated in the mining and construction sectors and little in the social sector. Therefore, there is need to consider more social sector funding through Belt and Road Initiative if Africa is to realize its poverty reduction agenda.
And we see that in 2017, the Chinese government enshrined the BRI in its constitution as an enduring legal provision for its global development cooperation. Then on the other side, on the African side, we have the CFTA, which is a flagship project of the AU's Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. Therefore, we know what we want as Africa. And Africa resolved to establish the CFTA in 2012, and the core objectives of the CFTA is to deepen economic integration amongst the 55 African states by creating a unified market for goods and services estimated at 1.2 billion people, with a collective GDP of 3.4 trillion US dollars. In some sections, they quote it at 2.5 trillion US dollars. But we also know that the CFTA aims to catalyze Africa's manufacturing potential, as well as to stimulate structure transformation process in Africa. So industrialization really remains a key development agenda for Africa, and Africa knows what it wants. Now the BRI meets CFTA. So originally, as already been alluded to, the BRI did not seem to go further than a couple of ports on the African continent. But today, 37 African countries have signed BRI MOUs, Zambia inclusive, and 28 countries signed up recently during the 2018 FOCAC summit. And therefore, when you look at the FOCAC and the BRI, these two frameworks present opportunities for job creation, income growth, as well as increasing manufacturing capacity in Africa. And then there's a softer side to this as well, which was alluded to by the previous presenter. The people-to-people exchange under BRI is an avenue for building capacity. Because under BRI, China seeks to build human capital around the globe through exchange of ideas and education, culture, science and technology. And this even goes further to exchanging ideas and ideologies of political parties or among political parties and think tanks such as the forum we have here today. And of course, governance looks at how the company's leadership and executive structures are established. But of course, PS Chola Chabala tried to dispel this, that it's also up to Africa to strengthen regulatory institutions so that we can leverage the BRI and increase Chinese private sector engagement.
Mr. Inongelu Tangu said, GDP is not enough to measure the development of Africa. African economies are seen to be rising in GDP terms, but poverty levels seem to be on the rise. Therefore, there is need to interrogate Africa's development achievement through indices such as GNP. For Africa to benefit from the Africa-China relationship, there is need not only to promote industrialization, which might not lead to reduced poverty, but to promote cutting-edge technology through the Belt and Road Initiative.
There was also a question on, there was also some sentiments that were coming out about whether Africa is rising or not, and whether Africans are rising or not. So it's very clear that Africa is rising, but whether Africans are rising or not, I think it's very difficult to tell. Reason being that we measure our economic well-being using GDP, but what is the local content? What are the citizens' content into that GDP? Basically, we are talking about the GNP. So the GNP talks about what is happening to the citizens. So I think those that are in here, coming from all the institutions, probably maybe CSO, ZIPA, Minister of Finance, if I was to ask you what is the GNP for Zambia, I think we don't know. So I think we also need to invest in trying to measure how well we are doing as citizens. We know very well that it's very possible to have a GDP growth rate of 10%, but a negative GDP, in that the citizens are getting poorer and poorer, while the other component is growing. So we might hide our growth in GDP, but GNP will definitely show up in the poverty levels where there is high growth, but usually poverty and and all those are going down.
Mr. Mulemwa said through the BRI, FOCAC and CFTA, Africa has an opportunity to promote industrialization and local content development through policy and skills transfer from China to Africa. Mrs. Kediwo Nyeseka-Kela went on to say, manufacturing is low in Africa, and the key to development of the sector is to develop capacity for implementation of policies in order for Africa to tap into the Belt and Road Initiative.
We have industrialization policy as well as the local content policy. These are basically aimed to ensure that whatever investment is coming into our country has a meaningful effect on our people. If we talk about industrialization, it tells us that we know that, for instance, our friends from China, they form the two sets of investors, those that are resource-seeking and those that are market-seeking. Skills transfer is important if we still talk about local content. So we, as Africans, we are basically pushing almost the same agenda. We have different blessings. If you look at us in the southern region, we have minerals. We look at our friends on the north, or is it north and western? They have oil and all those things. We look on the other side, they have good animals. So we have different comparative advantages. So even as we go out, we are not competing because we are defined also by our different comparative advantages.
And a lot needs to be done in terms of improving our policies so that we could realize its intended objective. In many cases, we find out that other countries in Africa that have good policies, but what is lacking in those countries is the implementation part. They fail to implement those good policies towards manufacturing, towards industry. So I think what is key is to develop our capacity in terms of the implementers of these policies, that we realize their benefits to the continent.
Dr. Gabriel Pollen mentioned that there is need for Africa to understand the type of industrialization it requires in order for Africa to unpack the Belt and Road Initiative industrialization opportunities. BRI and CFTA, coupled with trade facilitation, will double the capacity for intra-Africa trade.
Development, industrialization can be understood as learning foreign technology. So it's not simply acquisition, installation of plant and equipment, but it's about ensuring that once that technology has come into the country, it's localized. So which means that there's need for technology transfer as well as knowledge sharing. On the other hand, we have to also look at BRI, what opportunities or threats it provides through the process of acquisition, installation, and localization of foreign technology. So we need to recognize that there's an essential role for the states to play, not necessarily from the point of view of policy, but from the point of view of ensuring that they can guide and coordinate investments that will underpin an integrated structure of production, that being the bedrock for a sustained industrialization.
When we look at why we have been trading at very low volumes as Africans, one reason cited is the poor infrastructure, which really increases the cost of doing business. And when you look at the study done by ECA before the formation of the CFTA, it clearly highlighted that having the Continental Free Trade Area coupled with effective trade facilitation will make us double our intra-African trade.
Topic 6 was on the impact of the US-China trade war on Africa's development agenda and was presented by Mr. Baso Nzenze, lecturer and research director at University of Johannesburg in South Africa. The discussants included Elizabeth Birabwa, Economic Advisor at Economic Policy Research Center in Uganda, Dr. Fanuel Kenala Bokosi, Executive Director at Afrodad in Zimbabwe, and Mr. Hansen from Huawei, Zambia.
Huawei, we mean is how China can do it.
The presentation highlighted that the US-China trade war is about copyrights and trademarks, and less about goods. The US-China trade war will have negative effects on the resources, as it will increase the need for African natural resources by China, thereby increasing the resource extraction. On the other hand, the trade war offers an opportunity for Africa to export their products to China, especially agricultural produce.
So discussions about Africa-China relations are not above the fray, so to speak. In fact, they are framed by considerations of how the United States will react or what the United States thinks, whether they're cooperating, whether they are fighting. Hence we get literature on the new scramble for Africa or the death trap discourse, which arguably has come from the West. Because in America's view, the trade war began perhaps as soon as the 80s when, as the Americans would have it, China has been stealing intellectual property, stealing technology, not been a very fair partner to them.
The discussions presented that the growing investment of China in Africa in the mining and construction sectors entails that governments need to implement policies that promote agro-industrialization. This therefore calls for governments in their negotiations for BRI to negotiate for agro-industrialization, which is beneficial to the 60% of the African population, which is dependent on agriculture. This was mentioned by Ms. Elizabeth Birabwa.
To have demand globally. Why do I say this? There is no reason why China would be spending billions and billions of its money to invest in infrastructure in Africa if it's not interested in our resources. So I do believe that China and US are still interested in Africa's natural resources, particularly oil. And all these BIR investments are targeting nothing more than our natural resources. So, for me, I still believe Africa will continue to export its natural resources to both US and China. However, the issue of concern is, will we continue to export in the raw form? I think that is where we need to focus as Africans, because we have done this since time immemorial and it has not led to our development. In other words, we are only having imbalanced development where poverty is on the rise, inequality is on the rise, and yet we are continuing to export initially to the West and now to China. So what this implies is, one, Africa needs to focus on its agro-industrialization agenda. The majority of Africans, the 60% we talk about, are engaged in agriculture. And from the presentation, you've noted there is an opening for our agriculture commodities, both in China and USA. The issue is for our states, our policy makers, to come up and devise strategies of how Africa can use the funding that China is providing us to divert it from just basic road infrastructure to agro industry and processing.
The Dr. Bokosi said think tanks should help government to develop strategies that will take advantage of the trade war so that through the increased interest of China in Africa, Africa can receive maximum benefits.
This war, trade war, we have a choice as Africans. Do we become the grass? Or do we become the monkey that is up the tree to see these guys fight? Do we become the monkey, the hyena that actually says, I'll wait until one kills the other and then I'm going to devour the carcass? Or do we become the grass? What am I saying? What I'm saying is that I think we are focusing on the wrong issue when we say, what is the impact of Chinese and US trade war on Africa? What you should be thinking is, when your two enemies are fighting, they have taken their eye off you. This is your chance to exploit that and see how you benefit from it. And that's why I like what the doctor says in terms of what are the things that Africa can provide in the environment that tariffs have been increased. Because when we do that, we actually win. When we begin to actually look at this as an opportunity to say, how do we begin to take this as an advantage? So for me, I see opportunities if we position ourselves. But if we live the way we are living to wait until they fight, we chose to be the grass because we will be the people who suffer. How are we going to suffer? If China's economy starts to go down because of the trade wars, our exports will begin to go down and everything else will suffer. China will start not giving us all the loans because they will have less money. The US will begin to focus on their own industry. They will not give a lot of money to Africa because they will have to do their own social programs to support their own people. And that's where we make the choice. So I will finally say, it is up to us to make a decision. Do we become the grass under the two elephants fighting? Or the monkey that watches them and enjoys the fun? Or the hyena that says, while they are fighting, when one of you dies, I'm going to have my meal in the evening. Thank you.
Mr. Hansen said China should focus on transferring skills in order to help add value to their exports.
Today, actually, this topic to our companies big so impact to the Africa. But I want to see today, my topic is want to see how can we Chinese enterprise to help Africa to reduce the impact from outside of Africa. Because in China we have a word we see it is better to teach because we are also the vice chair of the Association of Chinese Enterprise in Zambia. So what we are doing want to see is how can we help Africa to do their capacity building, to do the skill transfer, to let Africa to empower themselves.
Topic 7 of the forum was on rebranding Africa in the new global order and was made by Dr. Caleb Fundanga.
I'm glad to say that Zambia has been at the forefront of helping countries to liberate themselves and also to end the fighting that they started themselves after being liberated. Diseases, hunger, and natural calamities are the order of the day. It's not that other parts of the world don't face calamities. But here we don't have the capacity to actually survive floods. We always look to the outside world to provide us with assistance. Now, brands can be for a single product or can be for a group of products sold under the same brand. And it can also be for an institution. Most of you in your institutions, you are trying to brand yourselves, isn't it? I'm sure you do read all these statements of institutions where they talk of their vision. They want to be the best capacity building institution, the best think tank. Incidentally, a league for think tanks has also started. I'm hoping that PMRC can also be mentioned, but I can say that Africa Economic Research Consortium has been boasting that it is the best think tank in Africa.
It's being done by some American university, and every year, sometimes they do send us some questionnaires to comment on what you think is the best capacity building student. But I'm hoping that from here, all of us, when we go, can try to be the best think tank, so that we can join the league of think tanks. Now, of course, it is said that the ultimate brand is the nation. The state, the nation state is the ultimate brand. And you have heard, for instance, when you want to sell your animals, you go and say the best national parks are in Zambia. Everybody is claiming that they are the best, and Africans are very good at always claiming that they are the best. Although in the reality, probably they are not the best. But let me give you one example of how one leader tried to rebrand this country, from which we can pick up something when we go to those exercises of what messages are we going to give to brand our continent or our country. The leader I'm talking about is Tony Blair. I'm sure most of you remember that when Tony Blair was fighting to get to the top, the first thing he did was to rebrand his Labour Party. The Labour Party had a very bad image. It was a party composed of trade unionists who were always very opposed to investors, and always saying we'll sort you out and so forth, strikes and the like. So when he took over the leadership of the Labour Party, he talked of the new Labour. The new Labour Party. The new Labour Party was investor friendly and so forth. And all this was being done under the slogan, Cool Britannia. It's a cool place. And to send the message, ministries were asked to come up with new mission statements. We had, for instance, most of you will remember who are old now, that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, when going to present the budget, used to carry a battered briefcase, right? Under Cool Britannia, they introduced a new briefcase. So all these are messages you send to show that we are on top of things. Now,
the panel of discussants included Ms. Chenai Makumba, Center Coordinator for Consumer Unit Trust in Zambia, Dr. Thomas Muntali, Director General for the Planning Commission in Malawi, and Mr. Joseph Ishaku, Research Associate at Center for the Studies of the Economies of Africa in Nigeria.
Our brand Africa as a land full of youthful people.
The discussion highlighted that the current branding of Africa is by Western nations, who have not realized that corruption, coup d'etats and violence not only happens in Africa but worldwide. Africa has unique characteristics that the Western world has failed to use in branding Africa, such as its unique diverse culture, its endowments in natural resources, and its unique location. It is therefore necessary for think tanks to work with government to develop strategies aimed at reducing corruption, building stable economies, and development of human capabilities, which help improve Africa's image.
You know what champagne is? No. Champagne is a wine, white wine. Do you know why it's called champagne? No. It is produced in an area called Champagne in France. And so they have registered what we call geographical indications. So the champagne, that white wine, is only produced in one area in France. So South Africa tried to start producing South African champagne. They were closed down.
During the discussions, Dr. Thomas Muntali mentioned that Africa should develop its own image that won't be affected by images being portrayed by others, and that think tanks should help governments dictate the kind of investments from China and what type of trade they can harness from China.
Talking about that, by the way, Chair, can you just remind me what's the correct brand of Africa? Because we're talking rebranding here, so I don't know what the brand is now.
Corruption.
Okay.
War.
Okay.
Disease.
Fantastic. Let's stop there. Who branded that?
The West.
Okay. So we've got to begin to give our own brand. Let us not allow the West to brand us. And I think it is an opportunity now to say what brand should the West, should China have of Africa. And I believe that one of the brands, and by the way, they're saying rebranding Africa in the new global order. Meaning we've got to ask ourselves what is the new global order. Unless we know what is the new global order, we're going to rebrand ourselves differently to what the global order needs. So if we don't know that new global order, I'm sorry, this discussion is going to really take us nowhere. I believe that that new global order now is an open, capitalist, technologically driven society. That's what is coming out there. Okay, now if we are going to fit in there, to me the question then we should be asking ourselves, well, the branding that I would give to Africa now is a land of investment opportunities. If that is the brand that we're giving, a land of investment opportunities, then when we are defining how to then engage, for example, the Chinese, we've got to be telling them what is it that we want to invest in. And I think if we're talking here about industrialization, we're talking about manufacturing value addition. If they want to bring BRI, and we want to talk infrastructure, we've got to tell them where we need this infrastructure. And that is why we should make it a point that whoever we are engaging is talking to what we as Africans have defined. For example, in terms of infrastructure, we've got PIDA, Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. Is BRI aligned to PIDA? If it's not, then you are having the Chinese knowing exactly what they want to get from Africa and placing their infrastructure exactly where they want it so that they can harness the opportunities from Africa. Unless we begin to tell the Chinese, the West, and everybody else to say, you know what, if you're investing, because we're not just investing, we're asking ourselves infrastructure for what? Education for what? Whatever we are trying to promote in that brand, we should be asking ourselves, is this really helping Africa or is it helping our colleagues out there?
Ms. Chenai Makumba said the current brand of the image that Africa is experiencing is somewhat a result of Africa's decisions in relation to their management of affairs by African leaders. Rebranding at its current situation will entail a backlash from those benefiting from the mismanagement of African affairs.
And I think one of the issues that I think was raised by both speakers before was this issue of Africa's branding. And I think maybe to take it just a step further, it is absolutely correct to say that our branding came from the West. But I think something we also need to acknowledge is that as Africans, we accepted that branding and we decided to continue with that. And I think you don't see that any more dangerously shown than in our academic institutions, for example. I remember back when I was in university and I wanted to take a history class that was focusing specifically on African history in order to understand where we were coming from, in order to understand our rich culture. And you needed to take that as an elective. Within the African continent, when you're trying to understand our own history, we still have a situation where our education system is still very colonized, and in order to understand ourselves as a continent, you need to be taking that as an elective. And the reason that's important is because we're here discussing, think tanks. And I think a lot of the academics that are coming out and working in these think tanks essentially are coming from these academic institutions that still need to go a decolonization in and of themselves. So I think for me, that's an important component when we need to start thinking about branding. But also secondly, when Doc was sharing, I think about, where have we seen rebranding? I actually thought you were going to pick on Rwanda. Because I think for us on the African continent, I don't think I've seen any more intentional rebranding than as we've seen with Rwanda. A couple of months ago, we actually saw President Kagame spend, I think it was about 30 million pounds sponsoring what was called Arsenal, just so that when you are watching this football team playing, you can see Visit Rwanda on the sleeve. And he received so much backlash for that. I think there was a lot of media response to say, you know, this is one of the poorest countries in the world, we're sending this much aid, you know, and now they're sponsoring a football team. But I think he understood something which I think underpins this conversation, is that there is a need for us to be intentional about our rebranding, that there will be backlash, because there's definitely, I think, a certain amount of, well, certain groupings that benefit from the current status quo, but it's worth investing in. But it's important that even in that rebranding, we are actually making the meaningful change so that it's not just a brand, but actually something that's reflective of true change that's happening on the continent.
Mr. Joseph Ishaku said, while there are calls for rebranding Africa, what Africa really needs is repositioning itself in the global agenda through reduction of interdependence on foreign countries and, most importantly, investment in its people's capacity.
Like you rightly mentioned, Africa needs rebranding, but beyond rebranding, it needs repositioning as well. What are our priorities when we go to international fora to discuss, when we seek investments? Which type of investments are we seeking? Like Dr. Muntari mentioned, these have to align with our national priorities. So he said he will rebrand Africa as a land of opportunities for investment. I would say I'll brand Africa as a land full of youthful people, which is also big population. So that can contribute meaningfully to the economic development of this continent. And a lot of our investments have to go in building the human capacity of these people, investing in their education, investing in their health. And a particular sector that I would like to see African governments focus on is information technology.
The forum ended with the reading of the Lusaka Declaration by Dr. Diawara, remarks by the PMRC Executive Director and PMRC Vice Board Chairman, and officially closed by the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of National Development Planning, Mr. Chola Chabalala.
Good afternoon, or good evening, rather. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've come, after 2 days of very intense and Lusaka Declaration. The Secretariat has done a very good job in that sense. And I'm going to read actually what we thought are actually the key messages and key recommendations coming out of these 2 days of discussions. It's a draft format, so if you feel that I've left some very important issues that need to be taken on board, please feel free just to email them to our colleagues, to PMRC, so that they can take them on board. And next week we are going to send the final draft, the final declaration. Outcome statement. The Policy Monitoring Research Center, PMRC, in collaboration with the Embassy of the People's Republic of China in the Republic of Zambia, hosted the China Think Tanks Forum from 23rd to 24th May 2019 at the Intercontinental Hotel, Lusaka, Zambia.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very sure that you are tired. I wouldn't want to keep you here any longer. I just want to say that we are very proud as a ministry that hosts 3 think tanks in this country. And we are proud to host PMRC as one of our grant-aided institutions. There was a debate about financing of think tanks. In our own little way, through our own resources as government, we actually finance the operations of PMRC. We pay for the salaries of the members of staff. Why am I saying this? I'm just responding to one of the concerns that in Zambia we're doing it. We also finance the operations of ZIPA, which is another think tank. We pay for their operations, and we actually also demand for certain interrogations on issues that we feel they need to spend more time and research on. We also finance the operations of National Economic Advisory Council. And we're very happy and proud that these think tanks make us walk with our heads high. They made huge contributions, informed our strategic direction for the 7th National Development Plan, which I must say there's a very unwritten story. Maybe perhaps we haven't done enough to sell it. It's an 86% rating in Africa in terms of contextualizing the RISDIP, which is the Regional Integrated Development Plan for SADC, the Agenda 2063, and Sustainable Development Goals. Unless otherwise tables have turned, it has been for a long time topic in the African continent. And what we need to do, the biggest challenge for us is to make sure that it's fully implemented. And from that perspective, PMRC was part of it, ZIPA were part of it, and this is the extent to which we are benefiting from these think tanks that we are very proud of. As we come to the end of our deliberations, we look forward also as a ministry that is interested in evidence-based research and the role of think tanks to receive some of the recommendations so that we can put them into action. We will not take such a huge and successful meeting lightly. We'll go all the way and do the best that we can to make sure that we turn what has been expressed here from mere declaration of intentions to practical actions that can benefit the Republic of Zambia.
I'm a mining engineer who has roughly 40 years of experience in the industry. When you look at Africa, really, it's the center. Again, Dr. Fundanga said this, geologically, physically, almost the center of the universe. These distinguished speakers and panelists, members of the diplomatic corps, ladies and gentlemen, I'm truly honored that you have responded to this call to attend this important forum, given the many responsibilities that you have to oversee to be here with us. We look forward to seeing you again at another think tank forum when we shall again reconvene to discuss other topical themes affecting Africa and the world.
I'd like to invite everyone to just give a round of applause to the Secretariat, the PMRC. The team has done exceptionally well in organizing this event, and I'm grateful to the response by our friends from outside the country who have come to make this Africa-China Think Tanks Forum a reality. I'd like to express my gratitude also on behalf of the PMRC and Embassy to the moderators, the speakers, the panelists, and every delegate. It is encouraging to note that the discussions were very engaging and constructive, and it is from there that we have come up with this declaration. And this declaration will not end here. We're going to make noise with it. We're going to share it with relevant line ministries within the country, and also we'll send to our friends think tanks outside the country, those who are represented here, and also Dr. Diawara being the champion of it, who has read it. And we hope that at the African Union forthcoming meeting or forum, these will be taken into consideration.